I'm Miranda Wallace, 30 years old, and my family just slammed the door in my face again. My phone buzzed yesterday, a text from my sister, "Don't show up to mom's birthday party. You're not welcome." Her words hit like a slap, but they weren't new. For 6 years, I've been the outcast, the one they erased after I dared to chase my own dreams. Dreams they called childish. They thought I'd fade, that my designs would never see the light. They were wrong. My fashion brand, built from nothing, is now a name they can't ignore, but they don't even know it yet. Mom's 55th birthday party is tonight, a glittering gala at a Salt Lake City hotel hosted by their precious fashion empire. I wasn't going to crash it, not after their rejection. But then another message came from someone I don't know. "You're on the guest list. Be there." My heart raced. Who added me? Why? I clutched my grandmother's journal, its pages filled with sketches that fueled my fire. Her belief in me, unlike my family's disdain, built everything I am. I decided to go to face them, to show them I'm not invisible. At the party, I stepped into a sea of glares, my sister's venom, my mother's cold stare. Then I saw him, their biggest investor, watching me from across the room. His face froze, full of surprise. Did he know me? My designs. My pulse pounded as whispers spread. Something big was about to break, and it wasn't just their party. Buckle up, this drama's just getting started. Subscribe and smash the bell to see their empire unravel. 6 years ago, I stood in my mother's office clutching a portfolio full of dreams. I was Miranda Parker, then, 24, desperate to be seen. My mother Janet's office at Parker Couture was a fortress of her ambition, sleek desks, racks of haute couture, her control absolute. I'd poured weeks into a bold collection, my hands trembling as I laid out my sketches. Janet didn't even glance at them. "A frivolous fantasy," she snapped, her voice slicing through me. My father, Edward, sorting fabric samples, nodded. "It's not practical, Miranda. Amy's vision drives this brand." My sister Amy, 3 years older, smirked, her confidence a blade sharper than their words. That rejection burned, but it was just another scar in a lifetime of their favoritism. Growing up in Salt Lake City, I was always Amy's shadow. Janet and Edward saw her as Parker Couture's heir, their golden child who could do no wrong. Amy got monthly allowances, thousands to spend on silks and sequins. They bought her a top-tier sewing machine, sent her to Parsons School of Design, with every tuition dollar covered, even flew her to Paris Fashion Week to study trends. Her sketches hung framed on their walls, her ideas celebrated at every dinner. "Amy's a prodigy," Janet would say, her voice glowing. Meanwhile, I scraped by, working retail to pay for community college stitching, late nights with Grandma Dorothy's old needles and scrap fabric. My designs, hand-drawn, pieced together with thrift store thread, were stuffed in drawers, dismissed as childish by Edward. "Focus on something useful," he'd say, barely looking up. Grandma Dorothy was my only light. "You'll redefine fashion, Miranda," she told me over chamomile tea, her voice warm, unshaken by their doubts. When I was 10, she gave me her journal, its pages bursting with her own designs, flowing silhouettes, fearless patterns, dreams her family, including Janet, had crushed. "Write your own future," she wrote inside, her handwriting steady. She died when I was 16, but her words lived on, a spark they couldn't dim. I'd sneak into Amy's elite sewing classes, watching from the back, memorizing stitches I'd practice alone. At 12, I designed my first dress, my fingers bleeding from hand sewing. By 15, I'd crafted a gown from leftover scraps. Each piece I showed Janet or Edward got the same response: "Amy's the talent," they'd say, their eyes sliding past me to her. The favoritism wasn't just neglect, it was a wall I couldn't climb. Amy's room overflowed with new fabrics, her sketches sent to galleries, her every whim funded. I worked double shifts to buy a single bolt of cotton, my dreams pieced together in stolen moments. Family dinners were Amy's stage. Her latest designs sparked praise, while my ideas were met with silence or sighs. Why can't you be more like Amy? Edward once asked, his tone final. I stopped trying to win them over. Grandma's journal became my anchor, her belief, the only validation I needed. They'll see your worth, she'd promised, her hand warm on mine. That day in Janet's office 6 years ago was the breaking point. My collection wasn't just sketches, it was my fight to be more than their afterthought. When Janet called it frivolous, and Edward backed Amy's vision, every slight from childhood crashed back, every ignored sketch, every unpaid tuition, every time they chose her. Amy's smirk cut deeper than their words, her triumph built on their bias. I didn't beg. I didn't break. I packed my portfolio, walked out of Parker Couture, and swore I'd never chase their approval again. That night, in a tiny apartment, I opened Grandma's journal. Her words burned brighter than their rejection. I wasn't Miranda Parker anymore, not their discarded daughter. I took her name, Wallace, and vowed to build Atelier Wallace, a brand they couldn't ignore. Janet and Edward thought I'd fade, that my dreams would collapse under their weight. They didn't know I'd studied their flaws, stale trends, rigid designs. Amy, their pampered heir, basked in their favor, but I was forging my own path, fueled by Grandma's faith, ready to outshine their empire. The studio in Sugar House smelled of fabric dye and late-night coffee. I was Miranda Wallace now, 24, no longer a Parker. That cramped, chilly studio was where Atelier Wallace took shape. No investors, no backup, just me, a thrift store sewing machine, and Grandma Dorothy's journal. Her words, "Write your own future," pushed me through endless nights, drained bank accounts and dinners of instant noodles. Janet's frivolous fantasy and Edward's impractical taunts lingered not as pain, but as fire. I wasn't sewing Atelier Wallace to prove them wrong, I was sewing it to prove Grandma right. The early days were relentless. I pawned my jewelry to buy fabric stitched by candlelight when the electricity cut out. My first collection, vibrant, eco-friendly designs, unraveled at the edges both literally and metaphorically. But I kept refining, guided by Grandma's journal. Her sketches draped silhouettes, daring textures, patterns no one dared attempt, showed me what could be. She'd faced the same rejection from her family, Janet included, for her bold vision. That legacy fueled me. I wasn't just designing for myself, I was carrying her dream. A year later, I brought on Scott Adams, a pattern maker with the same hunger. We burned through long hours crafting collections to outshine Parker Couture's tired elegance. 2 years later, Amy hit hard. She trashed me online, labeling me the deserter who abandoned her family. Her posts spread through fashion forums, branding my work a reckless pipe dream. It wasn't just slander, it was a calculated strike, rattling my standing in Salt Lake City's fashion scene. Clients wavered, deals crumbled. I wanted to lash out to expose her envy, but Grandma's journal held me back. "They'll see you when you're undeniable," she'd written. So I stayed silent, letting my designs fight. Scott and I doubled down, securing a contract with a boutique chain that embraced our sustainable line. Atelier Wallace began to soar. By 2023, we'd moved to a sharp studio downtown. Our collections, bold green, one-of-a-kind, graced runways for major retailers, brands my family would have begged to impress. Fashion blogs called Atelier Wallace a game changer, but Janet, Edward, and Amy never noticed. They were too focused on propping up Parker Couture, its designs fading, its market shrinking. Amy's online jabs had fizzled, her spite no match for our rise. I still carried Grandma's journal, its edges soft from my grip. Every seam, every deal was a tribute to her, proof I hadn't failed her. I wasn't done. Parker Couture was slipping their trends, outdated, their grip loosening. My designs could crush them, and I knew their flaws by heart. Amy thought she'd buried me with her words. Janet and Edward thought I'd disappeared. They didn't know I was waiting, ready to step into their world, not as their daughter, but as the one who'd redefine their legacy. The hotel ballroom glittered, but the air was thick with secrets. I stepped into the Lion's Den, Janet's 55th birthday gala, a showcase of Parker Couture's fading glory. My heels clicked each step, a defiance of my sister's text, "You're not welcome." I wasn't supposed to be here yet. A cryptic message from an unknown sender had slipped my name onto the guest list. My pulse raced as I clutched Grandma Dorothy's journal, its weight grounding me. This wasn't about crashing their party, it was about facing the family that cast me out. Amy spotted me first. "What are you doing here?" She hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes narrowed, her designer gown a perfect mask for her venom. "You think you can just barge in after abandoning us?" I held her gaze, my jaw tight. "I was invited." I said, my tone steady, refusing to let her bait me. Guests nearby turned, their whispers buzzing like static. Amy's accusation wasn't just personal, it was a performance meant to paint me as the outsider. My chest tightened, but I stood taller. I'd faced worse than her theatrics. Janet swept in next, her smile as cold as her couture. "Miranda, this is my night," she said, her voice dripping with control. "Don't make a scene." Edward stood beside her, his glance dismissive as if I were a stranger. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, turning back to a cluster of investors. Their rejection stung, but it was familiar, an echo of every time they'd chosen Amy over me. I was the outcast, the one they'd erased when I dared to chase my own path. Then I saw him, their biggest investor, David Wells, standing across the room, his eyes locked on me, intense, unreadable. My breath caught. Did he know me? My work at Atelier Wallace wasn't a secret in fashion circles anymore, but I hadn't expected him here, watching me like I held a key he'd lost. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Someone recognized my name. Amy's glare sharpened, sensing the shift. "You don't belong here," she snapped again, stepping closer, her voice low but lethal. I didn't flinch. "Maybe you're wrong about that." I shot back, my words a quiet challenge. Janet tried to steer the attention away, her laugh forced as she greeted guests. "Let's keep this civil," she said, her eyes flicking to me like a warning. But the tension was a live wire, sparking with every glance. Edward muttered something to an investor, avoiding me entirely. I felt their dismissal like a weight, but Grandma's journal in my hand reminded me why I came. I wasn't here to beg for their approval. I was here to stand my ground. David Wells moved closer, his gaze never wavering. My heart pounded. There was something in his look, not just curiosity but recognition. Had he seen my designs? Heard of Atelier Wallace? The crowd's murmurs grew louder, and Amy's face twisted, her composure cracking. "You're embarrassing yourself," she spat loud enough for nearby guests to hear. I didn't respond, my eyes still on David. His presence was a wild card, a thread I couldn't yet pull. Someone had wanted me here, someone who knew my worth. The question was who. David Wells's voice boomed, cutting through the ballroom's chatter, calling my name. "Miranda Wallace," he said, his tone sharp with recognition. Every head turned, the hum of the gala faltering. I froze, my grip tightening on Grandma Dorothy's journal. David, their biggest investor, stepped forward, his eyes locked on me. "You're the mind behind Atelier Wallace," he declared loud enough for the room to hear. "Your designs are redefining sustainable fashion." My heart pounded. Atelier Wallace. My creation was no longer a secret. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others staring. I felt the weight of every gaze, but none heavier than my family's. Janet's smile vanished, her face paling as if struck. Edward's jaw clenched, his drink trembling in his hand. Amy's eyes widened, her confidence crumbling. "Atelier Wallace," she sputtered, her voice shrill. "That's you." The shock in her tone was raw, almost accusing, as if my success was a personal betrayal. They hadn't known, none of them had. For 6 years they'd dismissed me, blind to the empire I'd built from nothing. David's words hung in the air, a truth they couldn't ignore. I'd outgrown their shadow. My mind flashed back to a moment years ago, 2 years after I'd left Parker Couture. A family friend, Patricia Lee, had visited my tiny studio in Sugar House. She'd seen my sketches, my relentless drive, and promised to show them to someone who mattered. "You're like Dorothy," she'd said, her voice soft, recalling Grandma's untamed spirit. Patricia had sent my portfolio to David Wells, a silent ally who'd watched my rise from afar. That connection buried in time had brought me here, standing in their spotlight. David wasn't done. "I'm investing in Atelier Wallace," he announced, his voice firm, slicing through the room's tension. "It's the future of fashion, Parker Couture's falling behind." Gasps rippled through the guests. Parker Couture. My family's pride was suddenly fragile, its cracks exposed. Janet forced a laugh, her composure a thin mask. "David, let's discuss this privately," she said, her tone tight, desperate to salvage her image. Edward nodded stiffly, his eyes darting to the investors, now whispering among themselves. They were losing ground, and they knew it. Amy couldn't hold back. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, stepping toward me, her face twisted with envy. "You think you're better than us? You ran away." "Miranda." Her voice cracked, betraying her panic. The room watched, riveted, as her polished facade shattered. I met her gaze, unflinching. "I didn't run," I said, my words steady. "I built something you couldn't." The truth stung, and she recoiled, her hands trembling. Janet shot her a warning look, but Amy's outburst had already drawn blood. The guests were buzzing, their loyalty to Parker Couture wavering. David turned to me, his expression unyielding. "Your work's caught the industry's eye," he said. "I've been tracking Atelier Wallace for years." My chest tightened. Years. Patricia's quiet support had laid the groundwork, a bridge I hadn't seen until now. I glanced at Janet and Edward, their faces a mix of shock and denial. They'd spent 6 years pretending I didn't exist, but David's words forced them to see me not as their daughter, but as a rival who'd surpassed them. Amy's glare burned, her jealousy a raw wound, but I stood tall. This wasn't just my moment. It was Grandma's legacy, alive in every stitch I'd sewn. The ballroom fell silent, but my heart blazed with resolve. I faced Janet and Edward, their faces rigid from David's praise. "Your rejection forged my path," I said, my voice cutting like a blade. "You mocked my designs, but Atelier Wallace is outshining Parker Couture." Janet's lips parted, her poise fracturing. Edward's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. His pride stung. The guests watched, riveted, as their empire teetered. I wasn't their daughter tonight. I was their rival, undeniable. Amy stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "You're a traitor, Miranda," she snapped, her voice venomous. "You ditched us for your pathetic dreams." Ryan, Amy's husband, joined her, his tone cold. "You've always been selfish," he said, arms crossed. "Running off, tearing this family apart." Their combined attack was fierce, but it betrayed Amy's desperation. Her need to tear me down only exposed her fear. The crowd murmured, sensing her unraveling. Their aggression was a spotlight on her weakness, not my defeat. I gripped Grandma Dorothy's journal, its pages steadying me. Her words, "Write your own future," burned in my mind, fueling my resolve. Every dismissal, every slight had shaped me. I wasn't here to plead. I was here to stand tall. David Wells moved closer, his voice commanding. "Atelier Wallace is the future," he declared. "I'm partnering with Miranda, and I'm investing heavily." The room gasped, investors exchanging sharp glances. Parker Couture's grip was slipping, and David's words were a hammer to its cracks. Janet forced a smile, her voice tight. "Miranda, we're still family," she said, her tone almost desperate. "Come back to Parker Couture." I met her eyes, unyielding. "Family doesn't crush dreams," I replied, my words sharp. "I built my own without you." Her expression crumpled, the reality of her failure sinking in. Edward stood frozen, his silence heavy. Their legacy was fading, and they had no one else to blame. Amy's composure broke. "I ruined you online," she shouted, her voice shaking. "Those posts were mine to stop your little game." The confession stunned the room. Investors turned away, their faith in her shattered. Her allies fashion moguls she'd charmed, whispered pulling back. Ryan's scowl faltered, his support for Amy wavering as her outburst cost them both. The crowd's judgment was clear. Amy's venom had burned her own bridges. I caught Patricia Lee's gaze across the room. She smiled, her eyes warm with pride. Years ago, Patricia, a family friend who'd known Grandma's spirit, had seen mine. She'd linked me to David, setting this moment in motion. "You're Dorothy's heir," she said softly, stepping near. Her words anchored me, tying me to Grandma's legacy. I stood stronger, my purpose clear. David raised his glass, his voice ringing out. To Atelier Wallace he toasted, the new face of fashion. The guests applauded, their focus shifting to me. Investors nodded, drawn to my vision. Parker Couture, once untouchable, was now a relic. Janet and Edward faced the truth: their business was crumbling, their family fractured. Amy's glare was empty, her power gone. I didn't need to gloat. Atelier Wallace was my triumph, built on my terms, not theirs. As I left the ballroom, Dorothy's journal felt lighter in my hands. The night had shifted the tides. Atelier Wallace was no longer a whisper. Days later, my designs clinched contracts with global retailers, their eco-conscious lines outpacing Parker Couture's dated elegance. Fashion headlines crowned me the industry's new voice, while Parker Couture's orders dwindled, their name fading from runways. My studio buzzed with new hires, each stitch a testament to 6 years of grit. I'd built an empire not out of spite, but because I refused to break. Janet and Edward caught me outside the hotel, their faces weary. "We were wrong," Janet said, her voice low, almost brittle. "We didn't see your talent." Edward nodded, his eyes avoiding mine. "Come back, Miranda," he added. "We can rebuild together." Their words were heavy, a rare crack in their pride, but too late. I shook my head, my resolve firm. "I needed family, not a business deal," I said. "You chose Amy over me. Now I choose my path." I set my boundary clear and unshakable and walked away. Their regret lingered, but it was theirs to carry. Amy's fall was swift. Her confession, spreading lies to sabotage me, had cost her everything. Parker Couture's board sidelined her, her influence gone. Investors, once her allies, turned their backs, her venomous outbursts too costly. Ryan stood by her, but his support couldn't salvage her reputation. She was a shadow of the sister who'd once overshadowed me, her jealousy a cage of her own making. I didn't revel in her ruin, it was simply the consequence of her choices. I sat alone later, flipping through Grandma Dorothy's journal. Her sketches, bold and fearless, had sparked my fire. Write your own future, she'd urged, and I had. Every late night, every pawned ring, every stitch in my first collection led to this. I wasn't just Miranda Wallace, I was her legacy, carved from resilience and defiance. Patricia's faith, David's partnership, my own unbreakable will, they'd carried me further than Janet's approval ever could. I closed the journal, my heart steady, grateful for the woman who'd believed in me first. The future stretched wide. Atelier Wallace wasn't just a brand, it was a movement reshaping fashion with sustainable designs that spoke to a new era. I stood at its helm, not looking back but forward, ready to redefine an industry. Parker Couture's collapse was their lesson, not mine. I'd turned pain into power, rejection into triumph. Amy, Janet, and Edward faced the wreckage of their choices. Amy's sabotage cost her influence, leaving her isolated. Janet and Edward's neglect lost them a daughter and their legacy. Their story is a warning, dismissing talent, choosing pride over love fractures more than just a family, it destroys what could have been. To those listening, let this be your lesson. Your worth isn't defined by those who reject you, but by the courage to forge your own path. Trust your vision even when others don't. Thank you for following my story to its end. I'm grateful for every one of you. Share your thoughts below. What did this journey mean to you? Subscribe to join us for more stories of resilience and triumph.